"I'll take her," he said. And in a town where men measured worth in cattle and land, that sentence fell heavier than iron on dry ground, because no one in Red Hollow chose a woman like her, not openly, not without reason, and certainly not without consequence. Yet Ethan Caldwell stood there with dust on his boots and silence in his eyes, looking not at the men who laughed, but at the woman bound in the center of the square, her wrists tied with rough rope, her posture straight despite it, her dark hair catching the late afternoon light like a shadow that refused to bow, and the wind carried the smell of leather and sunburned wood through the street, as if even the air was waiting to see what he would do next. And she did not plead, did not lower her gaze, did not play the role they expected of her. Instead, she watched him the way a hawk watches the horizon, measuring distance, measuring intent, as if she had already seen men like him come and go and knew better than to trust what they said. And somewhere behind Ethan a man scoffed, low and sharp, saying he must be out of his mind, that taking her would bring nothing but trouble, that Apache blood carried stories that never ended well for men who crossed lines drawn long before they were born. But Ethan did not answer, not to them, not to anyone, because the truth was quieter than their voices, and it sat somewhere deep in his chest where no one else could reach. And the sheriff shifted his weight near the wooden post, unsure whether to laugh or intervene, unsure whether this moment was a joke or something that would echo long after the dust settled. And the woman's necklace, a small turquoise stone wrapped in worn silver, moved slightly against her collarbone as the wind picked up, catching Ethan's eye for just a second, long enough to feel like a memory he couldn't quite place, like a story told once beside a fire and forgotten until now. And he stepped forward one pace, then another, boots pressing into the packed earth, each step a choice he wasn't explaining even to himself. And the crowd's laughter thinned, stretched into something uneasy, because men understood instinct when they saw it, and there was no hesitation in him, no bargaining, no attempt to make this easier to swallow, just a quiet certainty that unsettled more than any raised voice could have. And when he reached her, he didn't touch her right away, didn't claim her like they expected. He simply stood close enough to see the small scar near her wrist where the rope had rubbed, close enough to hear her breathing steady and controlled. And for a moment, the entire town seemed to fade into the edges of the day, leaving only two figures, standing in a silence that carried more weight than all the shouting before it. And she tilted her head just slightly, not in submission but in question, as if asking without words why a man like him would step into a fire he did not start. And Ethan met that look without flinching, because out here, where land stretched for miles and names meant less than actions, a man's choice was the only thing that truly belonged to him. And he had made his. And somewhere behind them a horse shifted. Leather creaked, a boot scraped against wood, small sounds returning like the world remembering itself, and the sheriff cleared his throat, voice uncertain as he asked if Ethan understood what he was doing. If he knew what it meant to take responsibility for someone the town had already decided was not theirs to protect. And Ethan didn't turn, didn't raise his voice, only said, "I know enough." And the words didn't sound like defiance, didn't sound like bravery, they sounded like something simpler, something older, like a man choosing to stand where he was and not move. And the rope was cut, not with ceremony but with a quick motion that felt too small for the moment it carried. And her hands were free, though she didn't step away, didn't rush, just let her arms fall to her sides as if freedom was something she would examine before accepting. And Ethan stepped back half a pace, giving her space no one else had offered. And for a second, just a second, something flickered in her eyes, not trust, not yet, but recognition of a boundary he had chosen not to cross. And the sun dipped lower, painting the town in long shadows that stretched between them and the people who watched, and no one moved to stop him as he turned and began to walk, not because they agreed, but because something in the air had shifted, something that told them this story was no longer theirs to control. And behind him, after a breath that seemed to hold the weight of years, she followed, silent, measured, every step deliberate, and the crowd parted without thinking, creating a path they did not remember deciding to give. And as they moved through Red Hollow, past doors left half open and eyes watching from behind glass, past men who had laughed and now said nothing, the wind picked up again, carrying dust across the road in thin lines that erased footprints almost as quickly as they were made. And somewhere far off, beyond the edge of the town, beyond the line where buildings gave way to open land, a shape moved against the horizon, too distant to name, too still to ignore, and Ethan did not look back, not at the town, not at the men who would remember this day differently than they would admit. Because some choices were not meant to be explained, only lived, and beside him, the woman kept pace, her gaze forward, her necklace catching the last light of the day, glinting once, like a signal no one in Red Hollow yet understood. The road out of Red Hollow stretched long and pale under the fading sun, the kind of road that swallowed footsteps and gave nothing back, and Ethan Caldwell walked it without slowing, aware of the presence behind him not as a burden, but as a weight he had chosen, and the woman followed at a steady distance, not close enough to trust, not far enough to disappear, her silence louder than any question he could have asked. And the wind shifted across the open land, carrying the dry scent of sage and distant water, and for a while neither of them spoke, because out here words had a way of meaning more than they should, and saying the wrong thing could break something that had not yet been named. And Ethan glanced once over his shoulder, not to check on her, but to confirm what he already knew, that she was still there, that she had chosen to walk this path at least for now. And she met his glance without expression, her eyes steady, unreadable, and then she looked ahead again as if the horizon mattered more than the man beside it. And that was when Ethan realized she was not following him, not truly. She was walking beside her own decision, one that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with survival. And that thought settled into him quietly, like something honest he could not ignore, and the sky dimmed into shades of amber and gray as they reached the edge of his land, a stretch of worn fence and a small cabin that had stood through seasons without asking for notice. And the place looked the same as it always had, still, unwelcoming to strangers. And for a moment Ethan saw it through her eyes, a lonely structure in the middle of nothing, a place where a man could disappear and no one would come looking. And he slowed near the gate, pushing it open with a familiar creak that sounded louder now with someone else there to hear it. And he stepped inside without turning, leaving the space open for her to choose. And she paused at the threshold, her gaze moving across the cabin, the fence, the empty yard where nothing stirred, and something in her posture shifted, not fear, not quite, but calculation, the kind that came from knowing every place could become a trap if you were not careful. And she stepped through at last, the gate closing softly behind her as if the world outside had already begun to fade, and Ethan moved toward the water trough, dipping a cup and setting it on the edge within her reach without a word. And she did not take it immediately, watching him instead, as if testing whether kindness was real or just another form of control. And when he stepped back, giving distance again, she reached for the cup, her movements controlled, deliberate, and drank slowly, never taking her eyes off him for long. And the moment stretched between them, thin and fragile, and Ethan leaned against the fence, arms resting loosely, not approaching, not retreating, letting the quiet settle the way it needed to. And after a while she spoke, her voice low, measured, carrying the rhythm of a language that shaped her English into something precise, asking why he had done it. And Ethan did not answer right away, because the truth did not come in a single word, and he knew anything simple would sound like a lie. And he looked out across the land instead, the fading light turning everything softer than it was during the day. And finally, he said that some things were wrong before anyone decided they were, and leaving them that way felt worse than whatever came after. And she listened without nodding, without reacting, but something in her gaze changed, not softer, not warmer, just less distant, as if she had set aside one question and was already forming another. And she touched the small turquoise pendant at her throat, almost unconsciously, her fingers brushing the worn silver as if it grounded her. And Ethan noticed again the way it caught the last light. And there was something about it that did not belong to this place, something that carried history deeper than the town they had left behind. And he wondered, not for the first time, what kind of trouble he had stepped into, and whether it had already begun to move toward him from beyond the horizon. And the thought settled into the quiet between them, unspoken but present, like a storm that had not yet shown its shape. And night began to gather slowly, the sky darkening above them. And Ethan moved to light the lantern by the cabin door, its glow casting long shadows across the yard. And for a moment those shadows stretched between them like lines that could not be crossed without consequence. And she watched the light flicker, her expression unreadable again. And then she said one more thing. Not a question this time, just a statement. That men who made choices like his rarely understood what followed. And Ethan met her gaze, steady, unshaken, and said that understanding was not always part of the choice. And the wind moved through the fence again, carrying with it a faint sound from far off, something that could have been nothing, or could have been the first sign of something approaching, and neither of them turned to look, because some things did not need to be seen to be known, and they stood there in the growing dark, two strangers bound not by trust, but by a decision that had already begun to ripple outward. Beyond the land, beyond the town, into places neither of them had yet named. The night settled fully over the land, not sudden but slow, like a blanket drawn inch by inch across the sky, and the lantern by the cabin door flickered against the wood, its light small but steady, casting shadows that moved with the wind and stretched across the yard like quiet warnings. And Ethan remained where he stood for a long moment after her last words, listening not just to the air, but to the absence of sound that came with it. Because out here silence was never empty. It carried meaning, carried distance, carried the sense of something unseen choosing whether to come closer or stay away. And he had lived alone long enough to know the difference. And tonight the silence felt aware, and he did not say that out loud, because some instincts were better kept inside until they proved themselves. And he turned toward the cabin at last, pushing the door open with a soft movement that did not break the stillness. And inside the space was simple, one table, one chair, a narrow bed, the kind of place built for one man and no one else. And he stepped aside slightly, not inviting, not commanding, simply leaving room for her to decide again. And she remained outside for a breath longer, her eyes scanning the dark edges of the land, as if reading signs written where he could not see. And then she stepped in, slow, deliberate, carrying the same control she had held in the square. And the door closed behind her with a low sound that felt heavier than it should have, like something final settling into place. And for a moment they stood inside without speaking, the lantern light shifting across the walls, across her face, catching the lines of dust and travel that had not yet faded. And Ethan moved toward the small shelf near the window, taking down a folded blanket and setting it on the table between them, not handing it directly, not closing the space. And she watched the motion carefully, her attention not on the object but on the distance he kept. And after a moment she took the blanket, her fingers brushing the fabric with a familiarity that suggested she had known colder nights than this, and she draped it over her shoulders without comment. And the room held them both in a quiet that felt different from the one outside, more contained, more immediate, like the walls themselves were listening. And Ethan leaned one hand against the table, steady, grounded, and asked nothing, because questions could come later, if they came at all. And she moved toward the small window, her gaze drawn to the dark horizon beyond, and her hand rose again to the turquoise pendant at her throat, touching it lightly, as if confirming it was still there, still real. And the motion did not go unnoticed, and Ethan found himself watching it again. The way the stone caught even the smallest light, the way it seemed older than the rest of her. And he spoke then, not to demand, but to understand, asking where it came from. And she did not answer immediately, her eyes still fixed outside. And when she did speak, her voice was quieter than before, carrying something that was not quite hesitation, but not quite openness either. And she said it was not something given lightly, not something worn without reason. And the words settled between them, not an explanation, but not a refusal. And Ethan nodded once, accepting what was offered without pushing further, because out here, forcing truth had a way of breaking it. And the lantern flickered again as the wind pressed against the cabin, and for a brief second the light dimmed, shadows deepening. And in that moment something shifted, subtle, but certain, and she turned her head sharply toward the door, her body tightening just enough to notice. And Ethan felt it too. Not a sound, not exactly, more like a change in the air, the kind that came before something revealed itself. And neither of them moved quickly, because quick movements out here led to mistakes, and mistakes had consequences that lasted longer than the moment that caused them. And Ethan stepped toward the door, slow, controlled, his hand resting near the frame but not reaching for anything else, and he paused, listening, and there it was again, faint, distant, a rhythm carried by the wind, too steady to be chance, too far to name, and he glanced back once, meeting her eyes, and in that look there was no fear, only recognition, as if whatever approach belonged more to her world than his, and she did not speak, but the set of her shoulders told him enough, and he opened the door just slightly, enough to see beyond the threshold, enough to let the night speak for itself, and the land stretched out under the dim sky, quiet as it had been before, but now the silence held direction, and far beyond the fence line, beyond where the ground dipped and rose again. There were shapes, not clear, not close, but present, and they did not move toward the cabin. Not yet. They held their distance like watchers at the edge of something they had not decided to enter, and Ethan closed the door slowly, not with alarm, not with haste, just with the understanding that whatever had begun in the town had not ended there, and he turned back into the room, the lantern light catching his face again, and she was still by the window, her gaze no longer searching but certain. And after a moment she spoke, not asking, not warning, simply stating what already was, that the choice he made was no longer his alone, and Ethan stood there, steady as before, and answered in the same quiet tone that had carried him this far, that it never had been, and the wind moved again outside, softer now, as if the night itself had heard and accepted something neither of them had put into words, and inside the cabin, two strangers stood in a space too small for lies, bound not by trust, not yet, but by the weight of what was coming, and the understanding that neither of them would turn away from it. The night did not break, it deepened, and with it came a stillness that felt deliberate, like the land itself was holding its breath, and inside the cabin the lantern burned lower, its glow softer now, casting shadows that no longer moved as much but seemed to settle into corners as if they belonged there, and Ethan remained where he stood for a long moment, listening not just for sound but for intent, because there was a difference, and what lingered beyond the fence was not random, not lost. It was waiting, and he turned slightly toward the window where she stood, her outline framed against the dim light, her posture unchanged yet more certain than before, and the distance between them no longer felt like caution alone. It felt like understanding, fragile but present, and he moved to the small table, pouring water into a tin cup, the quiet clink of metal against wood the only sound that dared interrupt the silence, and he set it down again without offering, knowing she would take it if she chose. And for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have made it smaller than it was, and she stepped away from the window at last, her movement slow, measured, crossing the room without looking at him directly, and she stopped near the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the cup before lifting it, and she drank, not with haste, not with relief, but with the same control she carried in everything, and when she set it down, she did not step back. She remained there, closer than before, and her voice came softer now, not weaker, just quieter, as she said that the ones outside would not come unless called, and Ethan listened, not interrupting, letting her choose how much to give, and she continued, saying that they were watching, weighing, deciding what his choice meant, not just for him, but for her, for them, and the word lingered in the air longer than the others, because it carried more than it said. And Ethan leaned back slightly against the table, his posture easy but his attention sharp, and he asked only one thing, whether they were hers, and she looked at him then, fully, no distance in her gaze, only truth, and she said not in the way he thought, and that was enough to tell him there was more beneath it, more than he would understand in a single night, and the wind pressed against the cabin again, softer this time, almost like a whisper passing through the cracks, and Ethan moved toward the door once more, not to check, not to confront, but to feel the space between what was inside and what was not, and he opened it just enough for the night air to slip in, cool against his skin, carrying that same distant presence, unchanged, steady, and he stood there for a moment before closing it again, and when he turned back, she was watching him differently now, not with suspicion, not with distance, but with something closer to recognition, as if she had seen this before, a man who did not reach for what he did not need, a man who stood where he chose and did not move even when it would be easier, and she stepped closer again, not enough to erase the space between them, but enough to change its meaning. And she said that most men would have tried to claim something by now, something to make sense of what they had done, and Ethan met her words with a quiet steadiness, saying that not everything needed to be claimed to be real, and the sentence settled into the room like a truth neither of them expected, but both understood, and outside the shapes beyond the fence shifted slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to remind that they were still there, still watching, and the night carried on, unbroken. And inside the cabin the air felt different. Now, less uncertain, more grounded, as if something invisible had a line between them, and she reached again for the turquoise pendant, her fingers resting against it longer this time, and she spoke of it without being asked, saying it marked a path that could not be walked twice. That once chosen it did not lead back, and Ethan listened, not questioning, because he knew that kind of path, had walked one himself long before this night. And he nodded once, slow, understanding without needing details, and she lowered her hand, the pendant catching the lantern light once more. A brief flash that felt like a signal meant for something beyond the walls, and the moment passed, leaving only the quiet behind, and Ethan moved to the far side of the room, taking the chair and setting it against the wall, not sitting, just placing it there as if preparing for something that had not yet arrived, and she watched him do it. Her expression unreadable but no longer closed, and for the first time since the square, there was no tension in her shoulders, only readiness, and the wind outside shifted direction again, carrying a new note with it, faint but present, and this time they both turned toward the door at the same moment, not startled, not alarmed, just aware, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would change what was coming, and in that shared silence, something settled between them, not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that did not need words to exist, and beyond the cabin, beyond the fence, the waiting continued, patient, certain, as if the night itself had chosen to witness what came next. The sound came clearer now, not louder but closer, like a presence choosing to be known without announcing itself, and the wind shifted once more, carrying with it the faint rhythm of hooves against dry ground, steady, controlled, not rushed, and inside the cabin Ethan did not move toward the door this time, because he no longer needed to confirm what was already certain, and she stood still near the table, her posture no longer guarded but aligned, as if something long expected had finally reached the edge of its arrival, and the lantern flickered again, catching the turquoise pendant at her throat, and for a brief moment it glowed brighter than the light itself, like it belonged to something beyond the small room that held them. And she reached for it once more, her fingers steady, her breathing unchanged, and she spoke quietly, saying they would not come inside unless invited, and Ethan nodded once, not because he understood fully, but because he understood enough, and he stepped toward the door, his hand resting against the wood before pushing it open, slow, deliberate, and the night unfolded in front of him. Deeper now, the sky stretched wide and dark, and beyond the fence line the shapes had drawn closer, not enough to threaten, but enough to be seen clearly, riders, still and upright, their presence silent but undeniable, and they did not advance, did not call out, they simply waited. And Ethan stood there, not stepping forward, not retreating, holding the space between what he owned and what he did not, and after a moment she moved to stand beside him, not behind, not apart, but beside, her gaze fixed on the figures beyond, and there was no fear in her, only something older, something rooted deeper than the moment, and the two of them stood in that doorway, framed by lantern light and darkness, like a line drawn between two worlds that had not yet decided how to meet, and one of the riders shifted slightly, a small movement, controlled, and then another, until the group adjusted as one, not advancing, not retreating, simply acknowledging the man who stood there and the woman beside him, and the silence stretched, not empty but full, like a conversation held without words, and Ethan felt it then, not as pressure but as weight, the understanding that this was not about defense, not about territory, it was about meaning, about what his choice had become the moment he spoke it in the square, and he did not raise his voice, did not call out, because something told him that would break the balance that held the night together. And instead he stepped one pace forward, just enough to stand fully outside the doorway, leaving the cabin behind him, leaving her choice open once more, and she did not hesitate, stepping forward as well, until they stood side by side under the open sky, and the lantern light reached only so far, fading before it touched the riders, leaving them outlined in shadow and distance. And for a long moment nothing changed, until the lead figure slowly lowered his head, not in submission, not in surrender, but in something that carried recognition, and the others followed, one by one, the movement quiet, deliberate, like a signal passed without sound, and Ethan did not react, did not step back, because he understood enough now to know this was not a threat, not in the way he had known before, and beside him she exhaled softly, the first sound that was not measured since the night began, and her hand moved away from the pendant, no longer holding it, no longer needing it in the same way, and the moment settled, deep and still, and then, just as slowly as they had gathered, the riders shifted again, turning without haste, their forms blending back into the dark horizon, leaving no trace but the memory of their presence, and the land returned to its quiet, the wind easing, the night stretching out once more as if nothing had passed through it, and Ethan stood there a while longer, looking out into the distance where they had been, knowing that whatever had just happened would not be spoken of in simple terms. And he turned back toward the cabin at last, the lantern still burning, the doorway still open, and she remained beside him for a second longer before stepping inside, her movement no longer cautious, no longer testing, but certain, and when he followed, closing the door behind them, the space felt different, not smaller, but steadier, as if something unseen had been acknowledged and accepted, and she looked at him then, not with distance, not with suspicion, but with a quiet understanding that did not need to be explained, and she said only one thing, that the night had chosen, and Ethan met her gaze, steady as before, and answered just as quietly, that so had he, and outside the wind carried on across the empty land, leaving the cabin untouched for now. The cabin held the quiet differently after the riders were gone, not empty, not uncertain, but settled, like a place that had just been measured and found worthy of standing. And the lantern burned low now, its light softer, warmer, casting a steady glow that no longer flickered with the wind, and Ethan moved to adjust it without thinking, his hands familiar with the small routines that kept a place like this alive, and she watched him, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone trying to understand the shape of a man who did not act the way the world had taught her to expect. And when he stepped back from the lantern, the room seemed to hold them both in a different way, less divided, more shared, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left in the night that needed answering, and the silence now felt earned, not forced, and she moved slowly toward the table again, resting her hand on the wood as if grounding herself in something solid, something that would not shift beneath her feet, and Ethan took a seat against the wall, not claiming the space, not directing anything, just choosing a place where he could see the door and the window both, a habit built from years of living alone where awareness mattered more than comfort. And she noticed that, the way he positioned himself, the way he did not turn his back to anything that could change, and something in her expression softened, just enough to be seen, and she spoke again, her voice quieter now, no longer guarded in the same way, saying that the riders would carry word beyond the hills, that what happened here would not stay here, and Ethan nodded once, because that had been true the moment he stepped into the square, and he said that some things were not meant to stay small, and she studied him for a moment longer, then asked him why he did not ask who she was, why he did not try to understand what he had taken into his life, and Ethan considered that, not dismissing it, not rushing to answer. And then he said that names did not change what stood in front of him, and stories could wait until they chose to be told, and the answer lingered between them, simple but not shallow. And she turned slightly, her gaze lowering to the pendant at her throat, her fingers brushing it again. But this time the movement was not defensive, it was reflective, and she said that where she came from, a man who chose without knowing was either a fool or something else entirely. And Ethan gave the smallest hint of a smile, not amused, not dismissive, just acknowledging the truth in it, and said that he had been called both before. And the moment passed between them like a shared understanding that did not need to be named, and outside the wind softened further. the land stretching out in a calm that felt different from before, as if whatever had come to witness had already made its judgment and moved on. And inside the cabin the air warmed slightly, the lantern steady, the shadows no longer shifting, and she moved toward the chair he had set earlier, not sitting immediately, but resting her hand on its back, testing the space the way she had tested everything else. And when she finally sat, it was with a quiet certainty, as if the act itself meant something more than rest, and Ethan watched without staring, giving her the same distance he had from the start, and she looked up at him then, meeting his eyes fully, and for the first time. There was no barrier in that gaze, no calculation, no distance, just a quiet presence that matched his own, and she said her name, Nayeli, letting it settle into the room like something offered freely, not taken, and Ethan nodded once, repeating it quietly, not as a claim, but as recognition, and when she asked his, he answered just as simply, Ethan, and the exchange held more weight than any introduction spoken in the town, because it came without expectation, without demand, and the night continued around them, steady and calm, and for a while they spoke little, not out of avoidance, but because there was no need to fill the space with more than it required. And she told him small things, not everything, not the full shape of her past, but enough to place her within the world beyond the hills. And he listened without interruption, without judgment, taking in what was given and leaving the rest untouched. And in return he spoke of the land, of the seasons that shaped it, of the way the wind changed before the rain came, of the quiet that followed a storm. And the conversation moved slowly, not forced, not hurried, like two paths crossing and deciding, without words, to walk alongside each other for a while. And as the lantern burned lower, the edges of the room softened further, and the space between them no longer felt like distance at all, but like something chosen, something respected. And when the night deepened enough that even the horizon disappeared, Ethan rose to tend the lantern once more, dimming it slightly, and she watched him, her gaze steady, her posture at ease in a way it had not been before. And in that moment, without declaration, without promise, something shifted between them, not trust fully formed, not yet, but the beginning of it, quiet and unspoken, and outside the land lay still under the dark sky, carrying forward what had begun, beyond the cabin, beyond the night, into a story neither of them had finished telling. Morning did not arrive with noise. It came quietly, like light remembering the land, and the first pale glow slipped through the edges of the window, brushing against the worn wood and the stillness inside the cabin. And Ethan was already awake, not because he had slept lightly, but because years of solitude had taught him to rise with the land rather than wait for it. And he stood near the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, watching the horizon as it slowly revealed itself, and outside the world looked unchanged, the same stretch of open ground, the same fence line, the same distant hills, but something beneath it had shifted, something that could not be seen but could be felt in the way the air moved, in the way the silence no longer carried uncertainty. And behind him Nayeli stirred, not suddenly, not startled, but with the same measured awareness she carried in everything. And when she rose from the chair, the blanket still draped over her shoulders, her gaze went first to the window, then to the door, and finally to him. And there was no confusion in her expression, only a quiet acknowledgement that the night had passed, and something new had begun. And Ethan stepped outside without speaking, the morning air cool against his skin, carrying the faint scent of dust and dry grass. And he paused just beyond the doorway, letting the land settle into him the way it always had. And for a moment he allowed himself to stand there without thinking of what came next, because mornings like this were rare, mornings where nothing pressed against him except the weight of his own choice. And behind him, he heard the soft movement of footsteps, and she stepped out beside him, the light catching her features differently now, softer, clearer, revealing details the night had hidden. And the turquoise pendant rested against her chest, no longer guarded, simply present, and they stood there side by side, looking out across the land that now held both of them. And for a while there was only the sound of the wind moving low across the ground. And then she spoke, her voice steady, saying that the riders would not return today, that they had seen what they needed, and Ethan nodded. Once, not asking how she knew. because he had learned that some knowledge did not come from explanation, and he asked instead what would come next, and she took a moment before answering, her gaze moving across the horizon as if reading something written far beyond his sight. And she said that word would travel, not just to her people, but to others, to those who listened for change, to those who watched for signs that the world was shifting in ways they could not control. And Ethan listened, understanding that this was larger than the land beneath his feet, larger than the town he had left behind. And he said that change had a way of finding its own path, whether men welcomed it or not. And she glanced at him then, a small, knowing look that carried both agreement and something else, something unspoken. And she said that not all paths were meant to be walked alone. And the words settled between them in the quiet morning air, not heavy, not demanding, just present. And Ethan did not answer right away, because some truths needed time to settle before they could be spoken aloud. And instead he moved toward the fence, checking the line where it met the gate. A simple act that grounded him in something familiar, something he could hold on to while the rest of the world shifted around him. And she watched him for a moment, then followed at a distance that no longer felt like separation, but like space given freely. And when he finished, he turned back toward the cabin. And she was there, standing in the open yard, the sunlight catching the edges of her hair, and for the first time since he had seen her, there was something like ease in her posture, not fully, not completely, but enough to be noticed. And he realized then that the space between them had changed, not through words, not through promises, but through something quieter, something built from choices made without expectation. And as the sun rose higher, casting longer light across the land, the cabin no longer felt like a place meant for one. It felt like a place that had begun to hold more than it was built for. And the thought did not unsettle him the way it might have before, and she stepped closer then. Not hesitant, not testing, but certain, and she said that there would come a time when he would have to decide again, not in a square filled with people, not in a moment watched by many, but in a quieter place where the choice would carry even more weight. And Ethan met her gaze, steady as always, and said that he had already chosen once. And she held his eyes for a moment longer, then gave the slightest nod, as if acknowledging something she had expected to find. And the wind moved through the land again, soft, steady, carrying forward the beginning of something neither of them had named. And they stood there together in the growing light, not bound by words, not defined by what had already happened, but by what had yet to come. And the land stretched out before them, wide and waiting, as if it knew the story was far from finished. The sun climbed higher, but the quiet did not break. It stretched, thin and watchful, like the land itself was listening for something it had not yet heard. And Ethan felt it before he saw it, a shift not in sound but in pattern, the way birds lifted from the far fence line all at once, not in panic but in awareness. And he paused where he stood near the gate, his hand resting lightly on the wood, eyes narrowing toward the distant road that cut across the low ridge nearly half a mile out. And there, just at the edge where heat and distance blurred the world, a single rider appeared, not rushing, not hidden, moving with a kind of calm that did not belong to chance. And behind him Nayeli had already turned, her posture aligning with the same quiet certainty she carried through the night. And she did not step back, did not move toward the cabin. She simply watched, and that told Ethan more than any warning could have. And the rider came closer, slow and steady, until the shape became clearer, a man alone, no weapon raised, no sign of threat, but something in the way he held himself carried weight, like a message walking on two legs. And Ethan did not reach for anything, did not prepare in the way others might have. He only stepped forward through the gate, closing some of the distance while leaving enough space to show he was not chasing answers. And the wind moved low across the ground, lifting dust in thin lines that faded as quickly as they formed. And the rider stopped, just beyond the fence, not crossing, not calling out, simply sitting there as if the ground itself marked the line that should not be broken. And for a moment no one spoke. And then the man inclined his head slightly, not to Ethan, not exactly, but past him, toward Nayeli. And she stepped forward then, just enough to be seen clearly. And the space between them held a quiet recognition that did not belong to strangers. And the man spoke in a language Ethan did not understand, his voice calm, even, and Nayeli answered in the same tone, the exchange short, measured. And something in the air shifted again, not tension, not relief, something closer to decision. And when she finished, she turned back to Ethan, her gaze steady, and said that the path was opening. That word had already traveled faster than the rider, that others were watching not just this land but him. And Ethan listened, taking in the weight of it without letting it change the way he stood, and he asked only one thing, what the man wanted, and she looked back toward the rider, then returned her gaze to Ethan, and said that he did not come to take. He came to see, to confirm that the choice made in the town had not been undone by the night. And Ethan nodded once, because that kind of test made sense in a world where words meant little without proof. And he stepped forward one more pace, stopping at the fence, close enough to meet the man's eyes without crossing into something that was not his, and the rider studied him in silence. Not judging, not challenging, simply observing. And after a moment he gave the smallest nod, then turned his horse without another word, riding back the way he came, leaving no trace but the understanding that something had been witnessed and carried onward, and the land settled again as he disappeared over the ridge, and Ethan remained there a moment longer before turning back, and Nayeli was already watching him, her expression unreadable but no longer distant. And she said that the first step was never the hardest, it was the one that followed, the one taken when no one was watching. And Ethan met her words with the same quiet steadiness he had carried from the beginning, and said that he had not chosen for anyone else to see. And something in that answer shifted again between them, deeper this time, like a line drawn not in the dirt, but in something that could not be erased. And the morning moved on around them, the sun rising higher, the light stronger, but the sense of being seen did not fade. It settled into the land like a truth that would not leave, and she stepped closer then, not testing, not measuring, simply closing the space because it no longer needed to be there. And she said that there would be others, not all of them quiet, not all of them patient. And Ethan gave a small nod, accepting what was already clear, and he turned toward the cabin, the fence, the land that had been his alone for so long, and now held something more. And for a brief moment he looked across it all as if seeing it differently, not as something to protect, but as something that had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. And when he looked back at her, there was no question left in his eyes, only the steady presence of a man who had already stepped onto a path he would not leave. And the wind carried across the open ground once more, not warning, not urging, simply moving forward, the way all things did out here, whether men were ready or not. By midday the heat settled across the land like a quiet weight, pressing down on the earth, on the fence lines, on the space between two people who now shared more than they had chosen to admit. And Ethan worked with steady hands near the barn, repairing a loose plank that had held for years without complaint, his movements slow, deliberate, not because the task demanded it, but because the rhythm gave him something to hold on to while the world beyond his land continued to shift in ways he could not yet see. And Nayeli stood a short distance away, not idle, not uncertain, simply present, her eyes moving across the horizon with the same quiet awareness she had carried since the night, as if she could read the land the way others read words, and the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like space chosen, space respected. And after a while she moved closer, her steps light but certain, and she asked him if he always worked when the world changed. And Ethan glanced up briefly, a hint of something like recognition passing through his expression, and said that the land did not wait for a man to understand it, so neither should he. And she watched him a moment longer, then lowered herself to sit near the fence, her back straight, her presence calm, and the pendant at her throat caught the sunlight again, brighter now, no longer hidden by shadow. And for a moment Ethan found himself noticing it, more than before, not because of what it was, but because of what it seemed to represent, something carried across time, something that had not been given lightly. And he finished his work, setting the tool aside before stepping back, wiping his hands against the worn fabric of his shirt, and he looked out across the land again, not searching, not expecting, just aware, and the quiet held. But it was not the same quiet as before. It was layered now, carrying the echo of the rider, the weight of what had been seen, and the knowledge that it would not end with a single visit. And Nayeli spoke again, her voice steady, saying that the man who came this morning would not be the last, that others would come not just to see but to test, to question, to decide what his choice meant for them. And Ethan nodded once, because that had already begun, and he asked what they would be looking for, and she turned her gaze toward him fully, not distant, not guarded, and said they would be looking for truth, not in words, but in what he did when it mattered, and the answer settled between them. Simple but heavy, and Ethan leaned lightly against the fence, his posture relaxed but his attention sharp, and he said that people often looked for things they were not ready to understand, and she gave the slightest nod, acknowledging the truth in that, and the wind moved again, carrying a faint shift in the air that neither of them ignored. And this time it was not distant, not hidden, it was closer, clearer, the sound of movement along the far edge of the land, not rushed, not concealed, and Ethan straightened slightly, his gaze narrowing toward the ridge where the ground dipped and rose again. And there, just beyond the line where his land met the open range, two figures appeared, not mounted, not distant like before, but walking, steady and direct. And Nayeli rose without hesitation, her posture aligning with something deeper than caution, and she stepped forward to stand beside him once more, not behind, not apart. And the two figures continued their approach, slow, deliberate, until they reached the edge of the fence, stopping just short of crossing, and the air between them carried a different weight than before, not silent observation, but something closer to expectation. And one of the figures spoke, his voice calm, even, and though Ethan did not understand the words, the tone carried meaning enough, and Nayeli answered, her voice matching his, steady, controlled, and the exchange lasted longer this time, not rushed, not uncertain, and Ethan watched, not interrupting, not stepping forward, allowing the moment to unfold in its own way. And when she finished, she turned to him, her gaze steady, and said they had come with questions, not demands, and Ethan gave a small nod, stepping forward just enough to meet the space between them without crossing it. And he said that questions were easier to answer than expectations, and the man seemed to consider that, his expression unreadable, and after a moment he spoke again, slower this time, as if choosing his words more carefully, and Nayeli listened, then translated, saying they wanted to know if Ethan understood what he had taken upon himself, not just the woman beside him, but the path that came with her, the eyes that would follow, the choices that would not end. And Ethan did not hesitate, did not look away, and he answered simply, that understanding was not something given before the choice, it was something earned after it, and the words settled into the space between them, not as defiance, not as pride, but as truth. And the two figures exchanged a brief glance, something unspoken passing between them. And then they gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in approval, but in acknowledgement, and without another word they turned and began to walk back the way they came, leaving the fence line untouched, leaving the space between worlds intact, and the land grew quiet again as they disappeared beyond the ridge, and Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer before stepping back, his gaze shifting to Nayeli, and she met it without hesitation, and though neither of them spoke, something had changed again, not in the world outside, but in the space between them, something quieter, deeper, like a truth that had begun to take shape without needing to be named. And the sun continued its slow climb across the sky, casting light across the land that now carried more than it had the day before, and the wind moved forward once more, steady, unbroken, as if it knew the path ahead would not be simple, but would be walked all the same. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, but the quiet no longer belonged to solitude. It carried meaning now, layered with every step that had been taken since the town, and Ethan felt it settle deeper into the land as the sun began its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the fence and the cabin, shadows that reached further than before, as if marking the space differently. And he stood near the edge of his property, looking out over the open ground where the figures had come and gone, where words had been spoken without raising voices, and where choices had begun to take shape beyond his control. And behind him, Nayeli moved through the yard with a steadiness that no longer carried hesitation, her presence fitting into the space not as something borrowed, but as something that had chosen to remain. And she paused near the water trough, her fingers trailing lightly across the surface as if reading the reflection of the sky. And she spoke without turning, her voice calm, saying, That what they had seen today would carry further than the riders themselves, that the story would not travel as a rumor, but as a question, and Ethan listened, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, and he asked what kind of question could carry that far, and she turned then, meeting his eyes with a quiet clarity, and said the kind that made people decide who they were before they were ready, and the words settled into him slowly, not as a warning, but as something closer to truth, and he nodded once, because he understood that kind of moment, had lived through it in ways he had never spoken aloud, and the wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant rain that had not yet reached them, and the land held that scent the way it held everything else, patient, waiting, and Ethan moved toward the cabin, his steps measured, not rushed, and she followed without hesitation, not behind, not ahead, simply alongside. And when they reached the doorway, he paused, looking at the worn wood, the simple structure that had once been enough for one life, and now held something more. And he stepped inside, leaving the door open, and she entered after him, the light from outside stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines, and the lantern still sat where it had been left, unlit now, because the day had not yet given way to night. And Ethan rested his hand on the table, feeling the solid grain beneath his palm, grounding himself in something that had not changed, and she moved to the window, her gaze lifting toward the sky where the light had begun to soften, and for a moment they stood in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the weight of what had already been said did not need to be filled. And then she spoke again, her voice carrying a different tone now, not distant, not guarded, but reflective, and she said that there would come a moment when others would not ask, when they would not stand at the edge of the land and wait. And Ethan turned his head slightly, his attention shifting fully to her, and he asked what would happen then, and she held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and said that would be the moment when his choice would no longer belong to him alone. And the room seemed to hold that sentence longer than it should have, as if even the walls understood its meaning, and Ethan took a slow breath, not reacting, not resisting, simply letting it settle where it needed to, and he said that choices rarely stayed where they started, and she gave the smallest nod, acknowledging that he understood more than he let on, and the light outside shifted further, the edges of the day softening into something quieter, and Ethan moved toward the doorway again, stepping outside as the first signs of evening began to take hold, and the land stretched before him, unchanged yet different in ways that could not be named, and Nayeli joined him once more, her presence steady at his side, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was no need to speak when the land itself carried the story forward, and then, far off along the same ridge where the rider had appeared that morning, a faint movement caught his eye, not sudden, not hidden, but deliberate, and this time it was not one figure, not two, but several, spaced across the horizon, not approaching yet, not leaving, simply there, and Ethan did not step forward, did not reach for anything. He only watched, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and beside him Nayeli did the same, her gaze fixed, her breathing even, and the distance between them felt different now, not a space to be crossed, but a line already shared, and the wind moved through the open land once more, carrying with it the quiet certainty that what had begun would not stop, not here, not now, and the sun dipped lower, casting the figures into deeper shadow, leaving only their outline against the fading light, and Ethan stood there, unmoving, knowing without needing to say it that this was only the beginning of something that would test more than just his resolve. And beside him Nayeli did not look away, did not step back, because whatever came next would not be faced alone, and the land held them both in that moment, silent, steady, waiting. The figures on the ridge did not disappear with the fading light. They held their place as the sun slipped lower, as if they had all the time the land could offer, and Ethan remained still at the edge of his property, his eyes steady, not measuring distance anymore, but reading intention, because there was something different in the way they stood, not like those who came to question, not like those who came to watch, but like those who had already decided to be present before the moment arrived. And beside him Nayeli did not move, her posture aligned with the same quiet certainty she had carried since the first rider. But there was something more now, something deeper in the way her shoulders settled, in the way her gaze did not waver, and the wind moved between them, low and steady, carrying the last warmth of the day into the cool of the evening. And Ethan finally stepped forward one pace, just enough to shift his weight into the open space. And the figures on the ridge responded, not with speed, not with urgency, but with motion, slow and deliberate, beginning their descent toward the land below. And the distance between them closed not in haste, but in inevitability, like a tide that did not rush because it knew it would arrive. And Nayeli exhaled softly, not in fear, not in tension, but in recognition, and she said quietly that these were not watchers, these were voices, and Ethan understood enough to know that meant something different, something heavier, and he did not step back, did not retreat toward the cabin, because the line between what was his and what was beyond had already shifted, and he stood where the fence ended, where the land opened, and waited, and the figures drew closer, resolving into individuals, their movements calm, their presence grounded, and when they reached the edge of his land, they did not stop at a distance. They came to the fence itself, not crossing, but close enough that the space between them felt intentional, not accidental. And one of them, older, his posture steady, his gaze clear, stepped forward half a pace, and the others remained still behind him, not silent in fear, but silent in respect. And Nayeli stepped forward to stand beside Ethan, not behind, not apart, and she spoke first, her voice carrying a tone Ethan had not yet heard, not guarded, not cautious, but rooted. And the older man listened, his expression unchanged, and when she finished, he spoke, his voice low, measured. And though Ethan did not understand the words, he understood the weight, and he waited, not interrupting, not assuming, because this moment did not belong to him alone. And Nayeli turned to him then, her gaze steady, and translated, saying they had come not to question, not to test, but to witness what had been chosen and to ask if he would stand in it when it was no longer quiet. And the words settled into the air, and Ethan felt them fully, not as pressure, not as demand, but as truth. And he did not answer immediately, because this was not a question for quick words, and he looked out across the land for a moment, the fading light stretching long across the ground, the cabin behind him, the fence at his side, and the people before him. And then he spoke, his voice calm, even, saying that a choice did not change when it was seen. It only became clearer, and the older man studied him for a long moment, his gaze searching not for weakness, but for something deeper, something that could not be spoken. And then he gave a slow nod, not approval, not agreement, but acknowledgement, and the others behind him shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, but aligning themselves with that single gesture. And Nayeli remained still beside Ethan, her presence steady, her gaze forward, and for the first time since the town, there was no distance between her world and his, not in that moment, not in that space. And the older man spoke once more, shorter this time, and Nayeli listened, then nodded, and when she turned to Ethan again, her voice carried something quieter, something that felt like a threshold being crossed, and she said that they would not return to take her, that the path she walked now was her own, but that the path he stood on would no longer belong to him alone. And Ethan nodded once, because he had already understood that, and the older man stepped back then, the others following without sound, and together they turned, not in dismissal, not in retreat, but in completion, and they walked back the way they had come, their figures blending into the dimming light until they became part of the land itself. And the quiet returned, but it was not the same quiet. It carried resolution, carried the weight of something accepted, and Ethan stood there a moment longer before turning back toward the cabin, and Nayeli remained beside him, her presence no longer uncertain, no longer testing. And as they walked back together, the last light of the day faded into night, and the land held their steps without resistance, as if it had already decided that whatever came next would not turn them away. The night returned without ceremony, but it did not feel the same as before. It carried something settled within it, something that no longer needed to prove itself. And Ethan stood just inside the doorway for a moment, looking out across the land that had witnessed more in a single day than it had in years. And the fence line no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a place where two paths had met and chosen not to turn away. And behind him, Nayeli moved quietly into the cabin, her steps no longer measured by caution but by familiarity, and she paused near the table, her hand resting lightly against the wood, as if the space itself had begun to hold meaning beyond shelter, and Ethan closed the door without haste, the soft sound marking the shift from open land to contained space. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to test, nothing left to prove in the way there had been before. And the silence now felt earned, like something built from moments that had not broken under pressure. And the lantern was lit again, its glow steady, casting light across the room that no longer felt divided. And Nayeli turned toward him, her gaze calm, and she said that what had happened outside would carry beyond both of them, not as a story, but as a mark, something others would see even if they did not understand it. And Ethan listened, not questioning, because he had felt that truth already settle into the land, and he moved toward the table, resting his hands against it as if grounding himself in something solid. And he said that marks did not matter unless they were left with intention, and she studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something she had been watching for since the beginning. And the wind moved against the cabin once more, softer now, no longer carrying tension, only movement, and she stepped closer, not to close the distance entirely, but enough that the space between them held something different, something no longer defined by uncertainty. And she spoke again, her voice quieter, saying that where she came from, a path like this did not belong to one person, it belonged to both who walked it. And Ethan met her gaze steadily, and he did not argue, did not question, because he had already stepped onto that path without naming it. And he said that some things did not need ownership to be shared, and the words settled into the room like something understood rather than explained. And the lantern flickered slightly, catching the turquoise pendant at her throat, and for a moment the light reflected in it in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the object itself carried a memory of where it had been and where it now stood. And she reached for it again, her fingers resting against it not out of habit, but out of recognition, and she said that it had been given to mark a bond that could not be undone. And Ethan listened, his expression unchanged but his attention complete. And she continued, saying that it had not been meant for her to wear alone, and the meaning of that lingered between them, not spoken directly, not forced into shape, but present in the way she stood, in the way she did not look away. And Ethan did not step closer, did not reach out, because this was not a moment for taking, it was a moment for understanding. And he nodded once, slow, acknowledging what was being offered without claiming it. And outside the night stretched quiet and wide, no longer filled with watchers or voices, but with something steadier, something that had already accepted what had been chosen. And inside the cabin the air held a different kind of stillness, one that did not press or demand, but simply remained. And after a moment she moved toward the chair again, sitting with a calm that no longer carried weight. And Ethan remained where he stood for a while longer before moving to sit opposite her, not across the room, not apart, but within the same space. And the silence between them no longer needed to be filled, because it carried everything that had already been said without words. And the night deepened slowly, the lantern burning low, and neither of them spoke of what would come next, because it no longer felt like something to be predicted. It felt like something that would unfold in its own time. And the land beyond the walls remained still, the wind moving softly across it, carrying forward the quiet truth that some choices did not end. They simply continued. And inside the cabin, two people sat in that continuation, not bound by force, not driven by expectation, but held together by something quieter, something chosen, something that had not needed words to exist. And as the lantern dimmed further, the shadows softened around them, and the night settled fully, not as an ending, but as a pause before what would come with the next light. The dawn came softer than the day before, not because the land had changed, but because something within it had settled. And Ethan stepped out of the cabin as the first light stretched across the horizon, his boots pressing into the same ground he had walked for years, yet it did not feel the same beneath him anymore. And behind him, Nayeli followed, her presence no longer a question but a constant. And they stood side by side without needing to choose the distance between them, because that choice had already been made in quieter moments. And the wind moved across the open land, steady and familiar, carrying no warnings now, no distant figures, no signs of watchers waiting beyond the ridge, only the long breath of the earth as it continued forward. and Ethan looked out across it, not searching, not expecting, simply seeing, and for the first time since the town, there was nothing pressing against him, no unseen weight, no silent test waiting to be answered, and he understood then that the hardest part had not been standing in the square, not speaking the words that changed everything. It had been staying in that choice when no one stood before him to question it. And now that moment had passed without breaking. And beside him, Nayeli lifted her hand to the turquoise pendant once more, but this time she did not hold it as something to protect. She let it rest where it belonged, and she said quietly that the path had accepted them, not as strangers crossing it, but as those who had chosen to walk it fully. And Ethan nodded once, because he felt that truth in the stillness around them, in the absence of tension, in the way the land no longer watched but simply existed alongside them. And they moved together across the yard, not in step but in rhythm, the kind that did not need to be learned. And when they reached the fence, Ethan rested his hand against the wood, the same gesture he had made countless times before, but now it carried something different, not ownership, not boundary, but memory. And Nayeli stood beside him, her gaze stretching beyond the fence to the open land, and she said that others would come one day, not to test, not to question, but to understand. And Ethan gave the smallest hint of a smile, not because he doubted it, but because he no longer needed it to happen for the choice to remain true. And the sun rose higher, warming the ground, the cabin, the space between them, and the quiet held steady, not empty, not waiting, simply present. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, because the story did not need more words to continue. It only needed them to remain where they stood. And Ethan turned back toward the cabin at last, not leaving the land behind, but carrying it with him in the way he always had. And Nayeli followed, not because she had to, but because she chose to, and the door remained open as they stepped inside, the light from the morning stretching across the floor, touching the table, the chair, the space they now shared. And the lantern sat unlit, no longer needed. In the daylight, and the air inside felt the same and different all at once, like a place that had witnessed something it would never forget. And Ethan paused near the table, his hand resting against it once more, and he looked at Nayeli, not searching for answers, not questioning what came next, but simply acknowledging what was. And she met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, steady. And in that moment there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend, only the quiet certainty of a choice that had not been broken by doubt or by distance. And outside, the wind moved through the open land, carrying the story forward in ways neither of them would follow. And inside the cabin, they remained, not as two people from different worlds, but as two who had chosen not to turn away. And the silence that followed was not an ending. It was something else entirely, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And it stayed there, steady and unshaken, as the day began again. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.